This video is made possible by NordVPN. Your privacy and security are super important. You can stay protected online with NordVPN. Get 70% off a 2-year plan plus 1 additional month free via the link in the description below, but more on them soon. In this video, I'm going to show you some interesting things you can do with models just like this. Now you can make this same video using 3D models inside of After Effects, and there's plenty of videos out there if you want to learn how to do that. But for this video, I thought we'd take real models, we'd film them, and then use them inside of After Effects. Now the first thing you need to do is work out what that model is going to be. So for me, I have this really detailed model and quite a large scale model of this helicopter. So the next thing is we need to go outside and we need to set up a blue screen or green screen. Now, because my model's green, I'm going to be using a blue screen in this case. And the first thing I did was I set up a frame outside. Then I grabbed my blue screen. Now the blue screen doesn't have to be an official blue screen. It can be just a blue sheet or a blue tarpaulin or something like that. Just something that's different color from your model itself. Then I draped and secured this over the top of my frame, and I ran the bottom of the screen right out and secured it on the end. Then I positioned a little riser somewhere in the middle of my screen to get my model up off the screen. Now, a couple of things you want to keep in mind is you want to try and get as much distance between the floor of your green screen or blue screen and your model. And the reason for this is you're going to get a lot of spill onto your model. The other thing is you may not need the bottom of the screen if you're not going to shoot directly down. Maybe you're just going to be filming straight on. So you only need the back part of your screen set up. So these are some things you want to take into consideration. So once I've got my helicopter and my screen set up, then I can position my camera. Now there's a couple of other things that I took into consideration while filming this. The first is that I already knew the shots that I was going to be putting this model into. Now that's really important to know because I want to try and match the lighting when I'm filming my model, as in the direction of the sun on my model is really important for when trying to make it match into my scene. So I could reposition my screen to make sure that it lined up with my scene ahead of time when I was filming this. Then I grabbed my camera and I just took a series of still shots of my model from the front and also from the side. And the other thing that I was taking into consideration here was the perspective. So when I'm looking at my scene, I want to try and match that perspective, as in, is the camera going to be looking on the underside of my model or is it going to be looking on the top side? So I need to try and take that in consideration when I'm taking those photos. The other thing that I did was, because I wanted to animate the blades later, I disconnected them from my model. So when I'm taking the photos, I didn't have these blades in the shot. Then I took those blades and I laid them flat on my screen and then took a photo from above so that we can take those blades and animate them separately in After Effects. Now, something else that I also did was I put my model on top of a Lazy Susan or a rotating base, where I could position my model in front of the camera and turn it very slowly. Now the reason I did this was the only thing that I filmed as video. And this gives me a changing perspective inside of After Effects, which allows me to use a moving scene. So if the camera is, say, panning across my scene, I can use that footage to get the right perspective or the changing perspective of my helicopter model. For those of you who don't have access to a blue screen or a helicopter model, I've supplied a few free files for you via the link in the description below. So let's jump into After Effects. But before we move on, a quick word from today's sponsor, NordVPN. Now, if you're someone who has never heard of the internet before, then I'm afraid we need to have a different conversation. But for the rest of us watching this video right now, then you'll want to protect your online communications and personal data when visiting your favorite sites wherever you are in the world. With a high level of encryption, a VPN makes it pretty much impossible to get hacked. Maybe after you're done watching this video, you want to kick back with some Netflix, but oh no, what's that? You can't, because that particular show is not available in your country. Well, no worries. I can click the country I want to join, and just like the power of video effects, be instantly transported to the new destination and start streaming. So protect yourself now and avoid your ISP slowing bring down your internet speed. Use the special coupon code flatpackfx and get 70% off a 2-year plan plus 1 additional month free via the link in the description below. So one way I used one of these models was I took the image of the side-on shot of the helicopter and I used it as a transition across the screen. So in order to create this sort of effect, what I need to do is I need to take my side-on shot of my helicopter here. I'm just going to right-click, create a new composition. Now the next thing is we need to basically mask out this helicopter or separate it from the background. Now there's a few different ways we can do this, but because this is a still image, one way would be to draw a very quick mask going around just to kind of roughly mask out the helicopter. Then I could come up to Effect, down to Keying and use the key light. And I could use this to try and get a really clean key of that helicopter to separate it from the background. Another option would just be to come up here and use the Roto Brush. Now you might think, why do we want to use the Roto Brush if we've spent all that time putting it on a blue screen? Well, I'll tell you this, you'll surely run into a few issues unless your background is really a different color from your model itself. The difference between this makes doing a Roto Brush much easier for After Effects because it's got much more of a differential between those two colors. So it makes finding the edges a lot easier for After Effects. So I could just go through here really quickly and basically mask all around the edges. So I'm adding to this. I'm also holding down Alt or Option on my keyboard to basically turn the head red, which will basically remove parts that I don't want. So the green is what I want to keep. And you can see After Effects is doing a really good job at trying to work out what I want to keep and what I don't. So once I've removed that from the background, we end up with something that looks like this. Then I can just adjust. What I've done here is just adjusted the edge. So that's just given it a little bit of a shift edge and a feather, which basically reduces that mask slightly over the model, and that just cleans up the edges, as well as a slight feather here. So you can see that's what we've ended up with. Now, because this is a still photo, I only need to take one frame. So what I can do is I can take this layer, I can come up to layer and down to pre-compose, and I want to move all the attributes, so that's going to move the Roto Brush tool into that. I can then take that new layer, come up to time and just freeze frame. And all that's going to do is just freeze that one frame. So the Roto Brush doesn't have to keep analyzing everything in the scene all the time. We now want to animate the blades spinning over the top. So what we did here, if you remember, we took these photos from above of the rotor blades in my shot. So what I'm going to do is drop them into my scene, and we need to separate these from my scene. Now, like we discussed before, there's a few ways we can separate this from the background. One way is to just draw a mask which goes around. Because it's an image, we wouldn't have to animate this for every single frame. We only need to do it once, and I could go through and spend my time doing that to get that finished mask. Another way would be to again take the Roto Brush tool and essentially double click that and start roto brushing these blades all over again. I can remove the parts that I don't want, so part of that background there, and take all of this part of the blades here until I end up with what I want. Or I could go back and use the key light to remove that background. Now, for those of you who want to know more about the key light, I'm going to show you that a little bit later in this video. But at this point, I'm just showing you a few different options of ways that you could remove those blades from the scene. I'm not going to show you frame by frame how to do that because I've already shown you how to do that process. You just keep repeating that process until you've cut all of those blades out. Now, in particular for my blades, what I ended up doing was using the pen tool. So I've drawn a mask, as you can see, all the way around my blades like this. So the next thing, what we want to try and do is animate those blades over the top of our helicopter. Now, because the helicopter's from the side, and these blades are from the top, we need to make them 3D and position them over the top. So we can simply do that by just hitting this button here, which is the 3D button. What we need to do is we need to reposition the center point to be on the top of our blade. So I'm going to hit Y, and I'm going to drag this using the pan behind tool to the center of that layer. Now what this will allow us to do is when I come down to the transform properties, it will allow us to rotate the blades. So before we do that, I want to now rotate this down to match the perspective of the side on. Now, this tool's available to me because I'm using the latest version of After Effects, which is After Effects 2020. If you're using an older version and you need to rotate that around, you can hit W on the keyboard and then rotate your layer around however you need. But for anyone using the latest version, it's nice and easy. We can just use this one tool. Then I need to position this so that it sits roughly over where the blades should be. So the blade should be roughly over this hole here that appears on the model. So now we can come down here and hit the Z rotation. I'm going to create a keyframe here. I'm going to go across probably around 6 seconds or so. And what I'm going to do is start to rotate this holding shift. I'm going to start to rotate this in a negative direction. So the reason for that is we want the blades to be moving forward. So this is the leading edge of the blade here. We want it to be moving in that direction. Now at the moment it doesn't look quite right, and that's because we need to add motion blur. So I can click this little button here and then this button here, and it's going to create that motion blur, which makes it look really nice as it's rotating around. So it's starting to look a lot more like a realistic model of a helicopter. Now, one of the things is we've got no center bit here holding up the blades, and that doesn't look quite right. So what I also did was I took this photo of the side of the blade. So this is basically the middle shaft part, and I've taken a side-on photo that we're going to use to overlay over the top of the model. So I drew a mask which went around the outside of that, and it's just a rough mask because it's going to be spinning so fast we're not really going to see it. And I also added these two masks which I set to subtract to take away this negative space here in the middle. So you just basically grab your pen tool, you draw a mask going around that whole thing, you draw two inner masks and you set those to be subtract, and that's going to subtract them away from that original mask to leave them as cutouts. Now once I had that in the right position, I made that 3D. Then I can scale this down and position it over the top of my helicopter here. So it's roughly in the right position that we need it to be. The other thing is I can make sure that this center point or the anchor point using my pan behind tool, which is Y on the keyboard, is right in the middle of this model. And what I can do is come down here and set the Y rotation keyframe here at the start, go across around 6 seconds and start scaling this up in a negative direction. So I wanted to spin quite fast here, and you can see we've got that animated sort of center shaft part that's really spinning quickly. And again, I can add a motion blur to this just to finish the whole thing off, and that's going to animate that whole thing. I can even scale this right up to make it spin even faster. Then I'm going to drag that layer underneath my main rotor and turn my rotor blades back on. Then I'm going to position the rotor blades so that they cover up that little middle part there. If I turn off all the motion blur, and you can see that whole animation is spinning really nicely and we can't see it anymore. So once I have that, then what I can do is I can take that same rotor, I can duplicate it, and I can essentially turn that into a tail rotor. So I can shrink this right down. I can also rotate this back, and I'm going to drag this behind my model because the tail rotor is on that side. So now I've got my finished helicopter with my blade spinning on the top and the back. I'm ready to now put that into my scene. So what I did was I created a new composition. I gave this one a name. And what I did was I have my first clip dropped here in the timeline. Then I took that side-on model that we just created, or that composition, and just dragged the whole thing on top. And you can see we've already got that model basically into our scene. Then all I did was I scaled it up to get the right sort of size for the flyby. And then I just basically created a position keyframe by hitting P on the keyboard. I moved this across a little bit here and just animated this flying by. So I went back here at the start and just animated that model flying across the screen. Now, one other thing I can do here is just add motion blur again to this composition, and that's just going to hide that scene as the model flies past. Now, one other thing I did here was I created a mask on that background layer. So I lined it up here with the top and the bottom wheel of my original shot. And I came down to the mask settings and I created a bit of a feather here. And then a mask path keyframe to animate that flying across. So it kind of does like a reveal. Animated this out here at the start. Then as I drag that next shot underneath, it then reveals that next shot as the camera, as it flies past the camera, giving it that transition. So one other thing I did here was I added a bit of a color correction to that model to help sort of sell the overall effect. So I selected that model, I came up to effect, down to color correction, and I added a lumetri color. Now I wanted to try and match to my scene, so I brought the temperature right up to try and give it a bit more warmth to try and add to that scene or match it to that scene. And I also brought the shadows down a little bit just to help bring that out, and maybe a bit of a contrast adjustment here. Maybe bring that saturation down slightly. You can also come down to the creative tab and just change the highlight, so I can give it a little bit more red there. And I could also give it a slightly different color for the shadows if I wanted to try and match between my two scenes. That just helps blend that overall transition. So that's how I did the flyby effect. Now another effect I did here was the helicopter flying at the screen. So it kind of flies out the screen at the camera, and I use that as another transition point. So what I did here was exactly the same process as we've done before. So I took my front on shot of my helicopter, which I've supplied for you via a link in the description below. So the first thing I did was I just added a really quick mask, which went around my model here, and that just separates most of the screen from that shot. I then added the key light. So I'm not going to show you the key light. I'm going to show you that a little bit later. But I added the key light over the top just to remove that background. Again, you can use the Roto Brush that we've done before. I use a mask to go around the whole model. And that's how you separate that, as exactly what we did before. I then added a rotor, which went over the top. And I also added another shaft here on the middle, which is also animated as a rotation. And then added a tail rotor on the back just to help give it that overall effect, to make it exactly the same as we did for the side-on helicopter. Then I took all of those layers. So I took the rotor, I took that shaft, I took the tail, and I parented them all to my helicopter layer, which is my main helicopter. The reason for this is now I can move it around a scene, and all of those layers are going to follow that model that I created. So wherever the helicopter goes, those things will also follow it. I also gave them all motion blur over the top, but I'll just turn that off for the time being so we can see what we're doing. I added my video clip in behind. So once I put it into my video clip, I then could animate it flying at the camera. So all I did here was I used the position properties, and I made this layer 3D, or the main helicopter 3D. And then I could move this back in 3-dimensional space. So essentially move it back into the background of my scene. And then I just created some keyframes here. So it's quite small in the distance of our scene. And then as it's flying towards the camera, it's going to grow in size as it sort of flies through the camera. So I'm just using the Z position here to animate that all the way through. So that's all I did to animate the position of that helicopter flying through. Then over the top, I just added motion blur, and that just kind of tied the entire effect together. The other thing that I added on here was then the color correction, which we also just looked at in the shot before. But I then just added a Lumetri color, and I then just added a little bit of color correction here by adding some temperature to warm the overall shot up. I can then adjust the tint here, added a little bit of contrast, and again I can add a little bit of shadow tint and a bit of highlight tint as well if you need it. But your settings for Lumetri color are going to be different from mine because your shots are going to be slightly different from mine. So you're trying to match it to the look of your shot. Now, one last thing you can do here is, because it's quite sharp in comparison to the rest of my shot, also added a camera lens blur. So what I did here was I came up to Effect, down to Blur and Sharpen. I added the camera lens blur, but you can use a Gaussian blur or any sort of blur will work exactly the same. And then what I did with that turned on was I created a keyframe roughly around here in the middle and scaled this up just to help give that a little, just to kind of soften out the model so when it's a bit further away it's not quite as sharp. And then I animated that down to 0 as it got closer to the camera. So as it's flying towards that camera, it's animating to 0, so it looks a lot sharper basically as it's flying into the scene. Now, the last part of this tutorial was taking the video clip of the helicopter rotating and we put it into a scene. So what I did for this was the clip where I had the helicopter rotating. And what this allows us to do was, if I was to mask this out and just put it straight into a scene, you're going to get a perspective shift of that helicopter as it's rotating. So if it was flying around in a circle, you would imagine the perspective of the helicopter is going to change. So at one point in the clip, it's going to be looking straight at you. As it turns side on, you're going to be seeing the side of that helicopter. So that's why it's useful to film a video like this, so that you have those options of messing around with the perspective shift. Now, this one I ran into a few issues of trying to mask it out because there's a lot of blue spill underneath the helicopter. So what I did was I created a mask which went around the outside, and then I created a mask path keyframe and animated that mask to roughly follow that rotation of the helicopter. So when I've done that, we've got our animated mask which follows the outside of our helicopter as it's rotating around. So now what we need to do is we need to try and remove the blue part of the screen. So for this one, what I'm going to do is use the keying. I'm going to come down and use the key light. Now for this particular case, when I select the blue screen, you notice that it removes most of the helicopter as well. Now, this is a problem because I've got a lot of blue spill coming off the screen onto the model because it's so close to the ground. So what I need to do is I need to adjust a few of these settings here to try and get as clean a key as possible. Now, you're never going to be able to just get one click and it's all going to work perfectly. So you have to kind of mess around with the settings under the screen matte, and you can come down here to the screen matte settings, and you want to try and make sure that the model is as white as possible and the background is as dark as possible. So we're trying to get that difference between the model and the background. The other thing you can do is also use the despill bias and the alpha bias by selecting a part on the helicopter that we're trying to keep, and you can mess around with dragging these up and down in order to try and keep as much as possible on that screen. So if I go back to my original one, what I've done here is I've used the screen gain and the screen balance to help balance that out. I've then used the screen pre-blur to help soften that screen, and I've used the clip black and clip white as I was showing you before to really try and soften out that screen. Now what I've had to do here is, if you left these settings and went back to the start, that's not going to work as well at the front part of this helicopter. So what I had to do was I had to animate all of those settings to be different for different parts of the video. Now all of this could be avoided if I'd created more separation between the screen and my model. So if I got rid of the bottom part, or the parts of the screen that I didn't need, I also moved the model way up in the air, it would have created a lot more of a cleaner key and better final results at the end of the day. But I think it's kind of good to show you that you don't need perfect results for everything you do. You just need to try and get it as close as you can. So what I did was, as you can see here, as I scroll down to the key light, I just animated a few keyframes here at the start with different settings. And then I created keyframes here at the end for all of those and just animated a change over time. Now, if that doesn't work, you can also use the Roto Brush as we've done before, or you can mask it out by hand. That's basically your options when it comes to doing this sort of stuff. So once I've got this model roughly masked out to where I need it to be, I want to put it into that scene. So I just created a new composition here with this video clip of this background. As you can see, it's moving. So then I just put the model straight in over the top of my scene and I scaled it down. Now at the moment it's facing the wrong direction. We want the helicopter to be flying in from the left to the right. So all I did here was just flip the orientation so that it's at the right orientation. And I just scaled this down, roughly positioned it where I needed it to be. Now at the moment you can see it's doing exactly what we did when we filmed it. It's rotating at the start. So what we can do is we want to try and line up the perspective. So I can move this model back and forth by dragging it here on the timeline to get the right perspective. So if it's coming in from the side of the screen, we don't want it coming in on the side. It's going to kind of be facing us. So I want the perspective to kind of be a little bit front and side on here. So what I can do is I'm going to record this by coming to the time and enable time remapping. I'm going to create a keyframe here at the start. And then I want the model to fly through the end part of my clip. So I roughly want it to move across at this sort of speed, but I want the position or the orientation to be about here. So I move my position on my clip around until I get that right sort of orientation or perspective. I create a keyframe there. Now I can move the clip back to the start and drag this out. And what we've done is we've slowed down that rotation to match to our scene. So just to show you, when I create a position keyframe here at the start, and I create a position keyframe here at the end, when the helicopter flies by, we're getting that correct sort of rotation or the perspective change throughout the clip. So that's really important to note. So once I got the helicopter positioned and moving in the direction I want, I could then add the 3D blades for the top and the back over the top of my model, and I've shown you how to do that. So they're now animated into the scene. Another thing I did was I also created a null object, and I parented these layers to follow that null object. And I created a position keyframe for that and a position keyframe here at the end. So all those layers are now following that model as it's flying across. So I've got the right perspective, I've got the animated blades on the top and the bottom. I now just need to match it into my scene. So what I did here was I added the Lumetri color over the top. So I came up here and added the Lumetri color as we've already done. And then I started messing around with the color correction again. So I turned up the temperature, I brought down the tint, I messed around with the black level, and also added some color into the highlight and the shadows. Something else that I also did here was I hit T on the keyboard to bring up the opacity, and I brought this right down. So somewhere around sort of 50%. And what that kind of does is it's got a kind of haze to this video clip. That haze, it kind of adds that hazy look to my model as it's flying across the scene and really helps sell the overall finished effect. So there was quite a lot in this tutorial, and I covered a few different things you can do by using these models in your scenes. Hopefully you learned something in this video. If you like this video, you can give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down. You can also check out more After Effects tutorials here on the side of screen. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.